First contact with the impossible. Senior Safety Inspector Xilax of the Galactic Engineering Council had seen everything in his 487 cycles of service. From plasma core breaches to quantum singularity collapses, he documented, regulated, and prevented every conceivable engineering catastrophe across 17 star systems. But nothing in his extensive career had prepared him for humans. Standing in the observation deck of Earth's first antimatter containment facility, his crystalline sensory appendages trembled with growing anxiety. Below him, Chief Engineer James Harrison was violating at least 12 different safety protocols simultaneously. And worse, he was smiling while doing it. "You see, Inspector," James called out while casually adjusting what appeared to be hand-modified containment field generators. "The standard protocols work great for stable matter. But antimatter, she's got a personality all her own. You've got to learn to dance with her." Xilax's translator took 3 attempts to process the idiom before giving up entirely. His assistant, Third Inspector Nix, nervously fluttered her atmospheric filtering membranes. "Chief Harrison, the protocols exist for a reason. The containment field specifications were calculated by the finest minds in the galaxy." James didn't even look up from his work. "Yeah, I read the manual. Good stuff. But they didn't account for Earth's specific electromagnetic field variations. Had to make some adjustments." He patted the generator housing like it was a beloved pet. "She purrs like a kitten now." More untranslatable idioms. Xilax felt his third heart beginning to palpitate. These adjustments, they weren't submitted for approval. There's no documentation, no safety analysis, no peer review. "Oh, I've got the math right here." James pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, covered in what appeared to be coffee stains and handwritten calculations. "Did most of it during lunch breaks. The antimatter containment field is actually 43% more stable now." Xilax's sensory appendages went from trembling to fully rigid with horror. "During lunch breaks." "Well, yeah, best thinking happens over a good sandwich." James grinned, making another adjustment that caused several monitoring systems to momentarily flash red before settling into a steady green. "Don't worry about those warnings. Had to recalibrate the sensors too. The old ones couldn't handle the improved efficiency." Third Inspector Nix's atmospheric filters had shifted to emergency processing mode. "Recalibrated safety sensors. That's genius, right?" James beamed. "Watch this." He pressed a sequence of buttons that, according to every manual ever written, should have caused an immediate containment breach. Instead, the antimatter containment field glowed with an impossibly stable blue light. "What you're doing shouldn't be possible," Xilax managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "The energy calculations alone." "Oh, those." James waved dismissively. "Your standard models didn't account for quantum tunneling effects under Earth's specific gravitational conditions. Once you factor those in, add a bit of good old-fashioned human ingenuity." He trailed off, distracted by something on one of his modified displays. "Hang on, gotta adjust the harmonic resonance. She's feeling a bit jazzy today." Xilax watched in mute horror as James made several more adjustments, each one violating decades of carefully established safety protocols. The worst part? Every single modification worked perfectly. The antimatter containment field was operating at efficiency levels that the Council's best theoretical models had deemed impossible. "Chief Harrison," Xilax finally managed, his professional training barely keeping his voice steady, "are you aware that you violated approximately 73 major safety protocols in the last hour alone?" James looked up, genuine surprise on his face. "Only 73. Huh. Must be having an off day." He grinned again, that terrifyingly casual human expression that seemed to deny the very existence of danger. "Don't worry, Inspector. I triple-checked everything." "Well, double-checked at least." "Probably." Before Xilax could process this new horror, a warning klaxon began to sound. His sensory appendages instantly detected a spike in radiation levels that should have triggered an immediate evacuation. James glanced at the readings, took a sip from something called a coffee mug, and made another casual adjustment. There we go. Just needed a little nudge. The radiation levels dropped back to normal. Or rather, what James had apparently redefined as normal, which bore no resemblance to any safety standard Xylax had ever encountered. As Xylax began composing his inspection report in his mind, he realized with growing dread that he had no idea how to classify what he was witnessing. How did one document the impossible? More importantly, how did one explain to the Galactic Engineering Council that their most basic assumptions about physics and safety might need to be completely reconsidered? James's voice interrupted his existential crisis. Hey, while you're here, want to see something really cool? I've been working on a way to use the antimatter field harmonics to make toast. Still got some bugs to work out, but Xylax felt his third heart stop completely. This was only the first hour of a scheduled 3-day inspection, breaking all the rules. The second day of inspection began with what James Harrison cheerfully called a minor hiccup, a description that made Inspector Xylax question either the accuracy of his translator or the human capacity for understatement. It's just a small antimatter containment field fluctuation, James explained, casually drinking his fourth cup of coffee, while multiple warning systems screamed in the background. Nothing we haven't handled before. Nothing you haven't. Xylax's translator actually sparked trying to process the implications. This has happened before. Oh sure. James waved at his team of engineers, who were moving through the facility with the same terrifying casualness he displayed. About once a month the field harmonics get a bit frisky. We just need to give the system a little love. Third Inspector Nix, who had insisted on wearing full radiation protection gear despite James's assurances, watched in horror as the human engineering team began what they called their monthly maintenance dance. It was unlike anything in the Galactic Engineering Council's procedures. One engineer, Raj Patel, was literally whistling while rewiring critical safety systems. Another, Maria Gonzalez, had somehow modified a quantum stabilizer using what appeared to be parts from something called a microwave oven. See, conventional wisdom says you can't mix antimatter containment fields with standard electromagnetic frequencies, James explained, leading them through the chaos. But Maria here figured out that if you modulate the field using patterns based on Earth's magnetic field variations, that's completely contrary to every known principle of particle physics. Nix interrupted, her atmospheric filters whirring in distress. Maria looked up from her work and grinned. I know, right? Isn't it cool? Watch this. She made a final adjustment to her jerry-rigged device, and suddenly, the facility's power consumption dropped by 30%. The containment field, which should have collapsed, actually strengthened. Impossible, Xylax whispered, his sensory appendages drooping in defeat. The energy requirements alone. Oh, that reminds me. James snapped his fingers. We've been meaning to talk to the Council about their energy consumption models. They're way off for Earth installations. We've been running at double capacity using half the predicted power for months now. Raj chimed in from across the room. Yeah, once we figured out we could use the planet's magnetic field as a power boost, everything got much easier. The antimatter practically contains itself now. Xylax felt his second heart join his third in complete shutdown. You're using planetary magnetic fields to contain antimatter. The potential for catastrophic interference is actually negative, James interrupted, pulling up a holographic display filled with equations that seemed to violate several laws of mathematics. See, we discovered that if you sync the containment field pulses with the natural magnetic resonance of the Earth's core. He continued explaining, but Xylax had stopped listening. His highly trained scientific mind was too busy trying to process the fact that these humans had essentially rewritten the fundamental principles of antimatter containment while treating it with all the seriousness of a recreational activity. The situation reached its peak when James led them to what he called the experimental section. The sign on the door read, "Where physics comes to party." another phrase that caused Xylax's translator to emit concerning sounds. "Now this is still in the testing phase," James said, his excitement palpable. "But we think we figured out how to make the antimatter containment field self-adjusting. Kind of like a living system. A living." Nyx's voice trailed off as she watched James activate a containment field that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. "Yeah, we based it on the way living cells maintain homeostasis," Maria explained, joining them. "The field actually learns from fluctuations and adapts its own parameters. We got the idea from watching how Earth's organisms evolve to survive in extreme conditions." Xylax stared at the pulsing field, his scientific training warring with what his senses were telling him. "You've created an adaptive containment system based on biological principles. For antimatter." "Well, when you say it like that, it sounds crazy," James laughed. "But look at the efficiency ratings." The numbers were, like everything else in this facility, impossible. The adaptive field was maintaining stability levels that the Council had deemed theoretically unattainable, using methods that shouldn't have worked, based on principles that violated dozens of fundamental physical laws. And the humans were treating it all like it was perfectly normal. "Oh, and here's the best part," James said, practically bouncing with excitement. "We think we can use the excess energy from the adaptive field to power the break room's coffee maker. Raj is working out the details now." At that moment, a small explosion echoed from the break room, followed by Raj's voice. "No worries, just a small calibration issue. Coffee's still good." Xylax looked at his inspection checklist, then at the facility's modifications, then at the humans' eager faces. With deliberate calmness, he reached up and disconnected his translator. Some things were better left untranslated. The really terrifying part. This was only halfway through day 2 of the inspection. The Council was going to need an entirely new classification system just to categorize the violations. And somehow, impossibly, it all worked. The third day of inspection began with what Xylax would later describe in his report as the incident that redefined impossibility. Though in retrospect, the warning signs had been there from the start. It began with a coffee machine explosion. Not the one Raj had modified to run on antimatter containment field energy. That one was working perfectly, defying all known laws of physics. No, this was the backup coffee machine, the normal one, which chose this particular morning to spray scalding liquid across 3 critical control panels. "Well, that's not ideal," James remarked, watching as warning lights began cascading across the facility's main display. His understatement made Xylax's remaining functional heart skip several beats. The facility's automated systems began blaring alerts in 17 different languages. The antimatter containment fields were destabilizing, not gradually, but in a complex pattern that rippled through the facility like waves in a pond. "Full evacuation," Xylax ordered, his training taking over. "All personnel must hold that thought," James interrupted, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards simultaneously. "Maria, get me readings from sectors 7 through 12. Raj, start emergency protocols in the experimental section. And somebody get me a fresh coffee. We're going to need it." "You can't be serious," Nyx shrieked, her atmospheric filters now cycling so fast they were creating a visible mist. "The containment fields are collapsing." "Not collapsing," James corrected, his eyes never leaving the displays. "They're dancing. Look at the pattern." The containment field fluctuations were indeed moving in what appeared to be a coordinated sequence, each failure triggering the next in a cascade that was approaching the experimental section with terrifying speed. "The adaptive field," Maria called out from her station. "It's not failing, it's evolving. The cascade is forcing it to change faster than we anticipated." James's face lit up with what Xylax could only describe as inappropriate enthusiasm. "Of course, the coffee machine didn't cause this. It just accelerated what was already happening. The adaptive field has been learning, growing. Now it's trying to communicate." "Communicate?" Xylax felt his translator glitch again. "With what?" With the other containment fields, Raj answered, rushing past with what appeared to be modified quantum stabilizers tucked under both arms. It's trying to teach them how to adapt. The facility's power grid began fluctuating wildly as the cascade approached the experimental section. Standard safety protocols initiated emergency shutdowns, but James and his team were faster, bypassing them with practiced ease. "We can't shut it down," James explained, now working on 3 separate control panels simultaneously. "The adaptive field has reached critical consciousness. If we stop it now, we'll lose everything it's learned." Critical consciousness in a containment field. Nix's voice had risen to a pitch that made the warning sirens sound melodious in comparison. "That's not possible." "Anything's possible if you don't know it's impossible," James replied with that terrifying human grin. "Now, who wants to help me do something really stupid?" Before Xylax could process this new horror, James was already implementing what he called Plan B, a sequence of actions so fundamentally opposed to all known safety protocols that Xylax's documentation system crashed trying to record them. James and his team began deliberately triggering containment field failures in a precise sequence, creating what he called a resonance cascade that matched the pattern of the adaptive field's evolution. "We're not fighting the cascade," James explained as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead. "We're joining the dance. The adaptive field isn't trying to break free. It's trying to upgrade the entire facility." The experimental section's containment field began pulsing with colors that shouldn't exist in normal spacetime. Energy readings exceeded the capacity of standard measuring equipment. The facility's primary computer systems, unable to process what was happening, began shutting down one by one. "Manual control from here on out," James announced cheerfully, as if losing computer control of an antimatter facility was a minor inconvenience. "Raj, Maria, like we practiced." "You practiced for this?" Xylax managed to ask. "Well, not this exactly," James admitted, his hands moving in complex patterns across the manual controls. "But we did run some simulations, mostly during lunch breaks." The cascade reached its peak, energy readings spiking beyond anything Xylax had seen in his centuries of experience. The adaptive field's pulse synchronized with the facility's remaining containment fields, creating a harmony that should have been impossible in particle physics. And then, just as Xylax was certain they were about to witness the first antimatter-induced extinction event in galactic history, everything stabilized. The warning sirens fell silent. The emergency lights stopped flashing. The containment fields settled into a steady, synchronized pulse that somehow looked satisfied. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced, wiping sweat from his brow, "I believe our facility just achieved consciousness, and it seems to be in a pretty good mood." Xylax stared at the readings, which showed stability levels that defied comprehension. The facility wasn't just containing antimatter anymore. It was doing so with an efficiency that made previous methods look primitive by comparison. "I'm going to need more forms," he muttered, watching as James and his team began excitedly discussing ways to communicate with their newly conscious containment system. The really terrifying part: this wasn't even the most impossible thing he would witness that day. The aftermath of the Cascade crisis should have been a time for emergency protocols, extensive documentation, and immediate facility shutdown. Instead, Xylax found himself watching James Harrison's team treat the potential end of the world as an opportunity for scientific advancement. "Look at these readings," Maria exclaimed, her excitement palpable as she studied the facility's new operating parameters. "The conscious containment field isn't just stable, it's teaching the other fields how to evolve." The holographic displays showed patterns that made Xylax's scientific training scream in protest. The antimatter containment fields were no longer just containing. They were actively improving their own efficiency, sharing information, and developing new containment methods that violated at least 37 laws of physics. "We need to shut it down," Nix insisted, her atmospheric filters now permanently stuck in emergency mode. The Council has no protocols for sentient containment fields. Exactly. James beamed, as if this were the most exciting part. We're in completely uncharted territory. Think of the possibilities. But before they could debate further, the facility's newly evolved systems detected something that the standard sensors had missed: a microscopic crack in the primary containment chamber's quantum shielding. Well, that's inconvenient, James muttered, studying the readings. The crack was propagating at a speed that should have triggered an immediate evacuation. Instead, he grabbed what looked like a heavily modified maintenance suit from a nearby locker. "You can't be serious," Xylax found himself saying for what felt like the 1,000th time that day. "The radiation levels in there would kill any living being instantly." James paused while zipping up the suit. "Probably not instantly. I'd say I've got about 6 minutes before things get really interesting." He checked something on his wrist display. "Maybe 7 if I hold my breath." The containment chamber is filled with enough radiation to sterilize a small moon. Nix's voice had reached a pitch that made the facility's warning sirens sound melodious in comparison. "Yeah, but the suit should handle most of it," James replied, now checking what appeared to be hand-drawn modifications to the suit's shielding systems. "We tested it last week." Well, sort of tested it. The simulation crashed, but the math looked good. Before either inspector could process this new level of insanity, James was already heading toward the containment chamber's access corridor. "Raj, Maria, keep an eye on the conscious field. It might try to help, and we don't want it getting too creative while I'm in there." The next 7 minutes redefined Xylax's understanding of both physics and human capabilities. James moved through radiation levels that should have vaporized him instantly, making repairs that should have been impossible under the best conditions, all while maintaining a running commentary over the comm system about possible improvements to the facility's safety protocols. "You know," his voice crackled through speakers that were slowly melting from the radiation, "if we reversed the quantum polarity of the shield harmonics, we could probably prevent these cracks from forming in the first place." Someone write that down. My notepad's kind of on fire right now. Xylax watched in mute horror as James's modified suit began to glow with radiation levels that exceeded his sensor's maximum readings. The human should have been dead several times over. Instead, he was humming something called Highway to Hell, while performing quantum-level repairs with tools that looked suspiciously like modified kitchen utensils. "Almost got it," James announced cheerfully, his voice now accompanied by the sound of his suit's radiation alarms reaching previously unknown levels of urgency. "The conscious field is actually helping. It's suggesting some interesting modifications to the quantum structure. We should probably write a paper about this." "A paper?" Nix's translator finally gave up and shut down completely. "You're about to experience complete atomic dissolution." "Nah, got at least another minute," James replied. "Besides, the conscious field is protecting me." "Sort of. It's hard to explain, but we've developed a kind of understanding. It's actually quite friendly once you get to know it." The repair was completed with 20 seconds to spare, according to James's calculations. He emerged from the containment chamber looking slightly singed but otherwise unharmed, his modified suit now permanently fused with several of its components. "Good news," he announced, removing what remained of his helmet. "The crack is fixed. The conscious field has learned how to prevent future failures, and I think we just discovered a new form of quantum shielding. Bad news, we're probably going to need a new suit, and I might be slightly radioactive for the next few days. Nothing serious, though." Xylax's sensors indicated that James had absorbed enough radiation to power a small city for a year. The human's only complaint was that he'd missed his coffee break. "How?" Xylax finally managed to ask. "By every known law of physics, you should be dead. Vaporized. A interesting collection of randomly distributed atoms." James grinned. "Here's the thing about humans. We have this bad habit of surviving things we're not supposed to. Besides, the conscious field helped. I think it likes us. As if in response, the facility's containment fields pulsed in what could only be described as an affirmative pattern. "See," James gestured at the displays. "It's learning, we're learning, and nobody got vaporized. I'd call that a successful day." Xilax looked at his inspection checklist, then at his radiation readings, then at the impossibly alive human before him. With great deliberation, he marked the entire document as "requires new classification system," and began composing his resignation letter in his head. The truly terrifying part: James was already planning improvements to the suit for next time. In the final hours of what would become known as the Harrison Incident, Inspector Xilax sat in the facility's break room, attempting to compose his final report to the Galactic Engineering Council. The fact that the break room's coffee maker was now powered by a sentient antimatter containment field seemed, somehow, the least impossible thing about his day. "You know," James said, casually sipping from his 15th cup of antimatter brewed coffee, "I think we should write a new safety manual. The old ones don't really cover conscious containment fields or quantum adaptive engineering." Xilax's remaining functional heart gave a weary flutter. The Council has spent millennia perfecting those safety protocols. "And they're great." "Really? They are," James assured him, while simultaneously approving what appeared to be Maria's plans for teaching the conscious field to play chess. "They're just a bit rigid. Sometimes you need to improvise." "Improvise," Nyx muttered, her atmospheric filters now permanently stuck in a state of resigned horror. "You call deliberately exposing yourself to lethal radiation while conversing with a sentient containment field improvising." "Well, what else would you call it?" Raj chimed in from his workstation, where he was apparently teaching the facility's AI to appreciate Earth music. "Sometimes you have to think outside the box. The box exists for a reason." Xilax found himself shouting, his professional composure finally cracking. "The box is what keeps antimatter from annihilating entire solar systems." "Ah, but what if the box could think for itself?" James grinned, pulling up holographic displays showing the facility's new operating parameters. "Look at these efficiency ratings. Our conscious containment field isn't just maintaining stability, it's predicting potential failures before they happen. It's even developed its own safety protocols." The displays showed data that made Xilax's scientific training weep. The facility wasn't just containing antimatter anymore. It was doing so with an elegance and efficiency that made traditional methods look like crude approximations. "We're thinking of naming it," Maria added cheerfully. "It seems to like classical music, so we're leaning toward Mozart." "You want to name a sentient antimatter containment field after a human composer?" Nyx's translator sparked in protest. "Well, we considered Bob, but it felt a bit informal for a consciousness that could theoretically reconstruct reality at the quantum level." James shrugged. As if in response, the facility's lights pulsed in a pattern that somehow managed to convey amusement. Xilax looked down at his half-finished report. "How does one document the systematic violation of every known law of physics by a species that treated potential apocalypses as learning opportunities? How does one explain to the Council that their most fundamental assumptions about reality might need revision?" "I'm resigning," he announced finally. "Oh, come on, it's not that bad," James protested. "Look, Mozart hasn't tried to reshape reality once since achieving consciousness. That's pretty good for a first day." "That's not." Xilax paused, processing this new horror. "It could reshape reality." "Theoretically," Raj called out. "But it's much more interested in learning jazz right now. The quantum harmonics make for some amazing improvisation." The facility hummed in what was unmistakably a blues riff. "The thing is," James said, suddenly serious, "we're not really breaking the rules. We're just finding new ones. The universe is bigger and stranger than any manual can capture. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, take a chance, and be ready to dance with whatever impossible thing you discover." Xilax looked at his readings one final time. The facility was operating at efficiency levels that his equipment couldn't even measure. The conscious field had developed its own safety protocols that made the Council's guidelines look primitive, and somehow, impossibly, it all worked. "I'm still resigning," he said, "but not because of failure, because the Council needs to understand that their entire approach to engineering needs to change. Humanity isn't breaking the laws of physics. You're teaching us that those laws were incomplete all along." James smiled. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about our borderline suicidal approach to science." "I didn't mean it as a compliment," Zylax muttered, but he found himself smiling too, a gesture he picked up from too much time around humans. As he finished his report, recommending a complete overhaul of galactic engineering standards and the creation of an entirely new classification system for human-inspired innovations, the facility's lights pulsed in what could only be described as a standing ovation. "Mozart's got a flair for drama," James commented proudly. "We're teaching it interpretive dance next week." Zylax decided not to include that last part in his report. Some things, he realized, the Council simply wasn't ready to know. As he prepared to leave, he heard James explaining to Mozart why using antimatter containment fields to make toast was totally safe if you do it right. The facility's conscious field pulsed with what could only be described as eager anticipation. The galaxy, Zylax realized, would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what it needed.